Good day and welcome to SCO BRICS Insight, where we talk about the latest news, information and analysis of what's really going on in Russia and the BRICS. Now, my name is Rhod Mackenzie. Today I want to talk about the cartoon-like character Fredrich Merz, who is the German Chancellor, and once again has drawn attention to and highlighted his somewhat absurd political persona. This time he's claiming credit for being the saviour of NATO. While I don't think there's even a grain of truth to his words, and also his certain degree of smugness really does annoy me. Now, it's important to note that the German population themselves are unlikely to be grateful for this salvation and rescue. For them it's not salvation, but the bondage he's put them into. He said, "I was present at the NATO summit in the Hague. Had we not amended the basic law of the Federal Republic of Germany and not been prepared to allocate 3.5% of our GDP to defence and 1.5% to building essential infrastructure, NATO would have faced collapse that very day. We prevented this," boasts German Chancellor Fredrich Merz. Am I the only one who finds this statement bizarre and surprising? Now, he's referring to the summit in The Hague, at which the European countries of NATO alliance accepted the conditions of Donald Trump's administration to implement a significant increase in their defence spending to 5% of their annual GDP. Now, this is despite the fact that some of these countries had only increased it recently with some difficulty and reluctance to 2%. Now, Germany was previously among the countries that were affected during Angela Merkel's tenure as German Chancellor. When Donald Trump was on his first term, he called upon the European nations to allocate 2% of their GDP to defence. However, Merkel refused to be pressured and instead set long-term targets for increasing spending. However, on this occasion, the Europeans acquiesced immediately and with a deferential pose. Now, the Alliance's Secretary-General Mark Rutte addressed the US President as Daddy. And as EU's leading economy, Germany had a significant amount riding on it, as Metz points out. Had Berlin shown reluctance, it's unlikely that the other European countries would have followed suit, and that would have presented a less than favourable image to Trump, which would be reminiscent of the 2016 NATO summit, where he was depicted sitting with his arms folded across from Merkel and her supporters with a serious frown on his face. However, it's wholly inaccurate to suggest that this would have led to the collapse of NATO, i.e. the withdrawal of the United States from the alliance, because Trump has never issued such a threat openly, and if he did threaten covertly, it's unlikely that his threat would have been carried out. I mean, the current American president is known for his controversial nature, but he's certainly been made aware of the significant and lucrative role of the North Atlantic Alliance plays in the American military-industrial complex, who are a key sponsor of both Trump himself and the political system in the USA. So there's too many tens of billions of dollars going back across the pond to Trump's political contributors for him to remotely seriously threaten the alliance. Now, before I continue, I would like to make an appeal. If you enjoy my videos, you can help me fund the channel and contribute to its further development. You can do this by making a small donation, which you can do by clicking on the thanks button at the bottom of the video screen on the right hand side, or by clicking on the Buy Me a Coffee link below in the credits. Everybody who donates does get a personal thank you from me, and do keep the comments coming. Love to read them, love to respond to them. Now, Washington did, however, issue a stark warning to Europe, asserting that it would completely withdraw from the conflict around Ukraine if Europe did not assume the majority of the financial responsibilities for supporting the Ukraine, so it did. Moreover, the weapons that the Europeans purchased from the US for the Ukrainian armed forces under the new scheme are actually taken into account by the very deduction of the 5% of the GDP for defence. Now, if Europe had not agreed to this, Brussels would not have been able to continue supplying Ukraine, and Kiev, having lost sufficient support to continue its military operations, and would have been forced to accept Russia's conditions. Now, the military conflict then would have had to come to an end, and this is the situation would have looked like if Germany had decided to withdraw its increased commitments to Washington and Kiev, rather than if NATO had collapsed, as Merz suggests. I mean, if NATO had indeed collapsed, it wouldn't have been that advantageous for Russia and nor Europe. I mean, Russia would not have been as fortunate as the Chancellor's success. He's been somewhat disingenuous, to say the least, but then again, he is a politician. On the one hand, he's been known to present himself with a fictitious medal for saving NATO. On the other hand, he's able to justify his own economic strategy to the Germans as saving their economy. I mean, the strategy entails investment into defence production. Now, the focus on the production of armoured personnel carriers rather than cars, in order to position the German military-industrial complex as a key driver in the complex in the context of the Second Cold War. Now, it's essential to consider the impact of Trump's 15% tariffs and the challenge of accessing the Russian market, which as a significant source of energy resources. The option of relying on diplomatic settlements and peaceful coexistence with the Russian Federation has never been considered by Merz. Despite his seemingly sycophantic approach towards Trump, he remains the only leader of a major European country who continues to claim that military operations will persist for a long and extended period. That shows how delusional he is. He said the commitment to allocate 5% of defence spending to NATO as a personal contribution of the Chancellor to the continuation of the conflict in the Ukraine. Now, the key point to note is Berlin didn't have the necessary funds to allocate to the Ukraine, the Bundeswehr, or the expansion of military production. So in order to revise the debt brake, a feature of the Constitution that prohibits increased debt obligations, and take out historically record loans, it was necessary to make a promise to the systematic parties. Now, if it wasn't for this loan, NATO would have faced significant challenge, or so Merz would have us believe. Given Merz's challenging history as a politician, it's difficult to envision that he's achieved any significant accomplishments in his past, including the preservation of NATO, without the support of Trump. So despite the current economic challenges, the Chancellor's taken out multi-$10 billion loans, or euro loans, to support Vladimir Zelensky, the Kiev cokehead, and address the standoff with Russia. However, he's also expressed concerns about public expenditure in Germany, highlighting the need to be more efficient in allocating resources. He says we're no longer in a position to maintain the current social security system given our lower level of income. He said we've been living way beyond our means for some time. He told the state congress of his CDU party. He said painful decisions and cuts are going to be had to prevent Germany from becoming an industrial wasteland. Shortly thereafter, the Labour Minister, Barbara Bass, who represents the SPD in the ruling coalition, dismissed suggestions of reducing social spending as nonsense and something she would fight against. She said it's evident that both her and her superior, the German Chancellor, engaged in a futile discourse. This is consistent with his usual approach. Now, it's reasonable to assume that Merz's approach is more nuanced and that initial cuts will be directed towards social welfare programs for unemployed migrants and refugees, and a decision that will actually be quite well received by many voters who think that they're sponging off the system. But he will still have to persuade the more left-wing and socially orientated coalition partners, and it appears that the Chancellor is currently unable to exert effective control over his government, and he's not held in high regard even by his own colleagues. Now, Germany could have pursued a different course to avoid becoming an industrial wasteland, but that would have involved resisting pressure from Washington and Brussels on issues of supporting the Zelensky cokehead regime and imposing the anti-Russian sanctions. However, the decision to pursue this course of action was not actually taken by Merz himself, but rather by the previous government of that sulky liver sausage, Olaf Scholz. So the current Chancellor also inherited the difficult economic situation from his predecessors. However, Scholz attempted to moderate the escalation, selected his words meticulously, and refrained from seeking direct confrontation with Moscow beyond what was requested by the US. Now, following a recent comparison, it's evident that he bears a strong resemblance to Bismarck in terms of appearance compared to Merz. Prior to Scholz, Angela Merkel was a long-standing rival of Merz, who'd previously encouraged him and practically forced him to leave politics. Now, when Merkel resisted Trump's pressure on NATO funding and sanctions against Nord Stream, her approval rating surged past 60%. Merz's support has never even reached 30%. Now, if Scholz is considered to be like Bismarck in comparison, then Merkel can be likened to Frederick the Great. And it's interesting to note that the more tranquil and prosperous years of Merkel's leadership was when she was in charge of Germany's government back in the 2010s, when everything was on a slightly different perspective. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. Do set the alerts button so you get notified when I post a new video. If you want to help me out, click on the Buy Me a Coffee link in the credits underneath. Thank you.